Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hopefully you can hear me talking. My previous recording of this never actually picked up anything on my mic. Nonetheless, we are going to be checking out the Fallout world lore from Alternate History Hub. And we're going to be trying to answer the question, is the world of Fallout lore believable? Or is it just the work of some half-baked writers? Let's get into it and find out.
History, humans have strived for better weapons and armor in an age of constant warfare. As technology improved, the conflicts grew larger, more devastating, but with all its violent tendencies, humanity never had the capability to destroy itself. Well, until 70 years ago. World War II brought on the ultimate deterrent.
Okay, we need to talk about this. The humanity can destroy itself meme. And with nuclear weapons, right? We can definitely we can maybe destroy ourselves with climate change. That isn't clear. And I'm not saying climate change isn't real. It's real. The question is, would small pockets of humanity be able to survive in a world racked by climate change? The answer is not super established. So let's talk about the actual science of what a nuclear apocalypse could and could not do. So in the 1950s, right, you had the US and USSR both had completed the research for not just nuclear weapons, but had created a super bomb, a fusion bomb, or a hydrogen bomb. This was several times the power of what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Add a couple zeros, the equivalent of dropping something like 10, 100, or even 1,000 World War II era fission weapons. That's how big these H-bombs are. And the US and USSR built tens of thousands of these in order to ensure that they would destroy one another in the event of a nuclear exchange. However, these were not weapons whose goal was to exterminate the population of the country. Their goal would have been to target strategically important targets and just beat them into the dirt, right? And what I mean by that is they would throw probably a dozen or more nuclear warheads at suspected launch sites, military bases, command and control centers, major population areas, factories and industrial towns. Those would be the targets of these nuclear weapons. So the theory of why this targeting basically factories and military bases in the United States would kill every living being in, say, Brazil or Argentina. The theory goes something like this, that a large-scale nuclear exchange would kick up a cloud of ash and dust so great that it would either irradiate the entire globe because of the radioactive dust, killing all life, or that it would kick up so much dust that it would actually cause a nuclear winter, similar to a catastrophic volcano eruption, would darken the skies and reduce food production or the ability of plants to thrive for several decades. Now, there are analogs in history where this has happened. For example, when the asteroid that eliminated the dinosaurs struck the Earth, that is a catastrophe on the scale of nuclear war. And while it did lead to the extermination of large amounts of life on Earth, it did not result in their final and complete elimination. Biodiversity dropped tremendously. Many branches of the tree of life withered off, but many branches survived, and from those branches grew much a comparable set of biodiversity, right? So, does that mean that humanity could survive in that world? I argue that human beings, because we're creative and can utilize technology, things like agriculture and whatnot, we probably would be able to survive in that situation. Now, would our civilization, would our forms of government survive? Probably not. Generally, these sort of catastrophes result in new sort of new forms of governance. Think the collapse of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Mongol Empire, that sort of thing. You know, you also have similar events in history with volcano eruptions, and those are ones that occurred while human beings are in the population. In the Middle Ages, there was a large volcanic eruption that did indeed cause not a nuclear winter, but a proper winter, a long period of cold through the Middle Ages, and certainly the inability to manage food production and the sort of subsistence living that most people had before this little ice age or this little global cooling, meant that even a few percentage points of reduced food yields or reduced crop yields would have been or was fairly devastating to the social order and to, well, people's lives. All that to say that if you look at disasters like Chernobyl, for example, something that happened, a disaster that happened 30 years ago, within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, yes, there are parts of it that are very irradiated, but there are still thriving natural life. In fact, it's functioning as a wildlife preserve because it's been cleared out of so many people. And while those animals that live their entire lives there are subject to higher levels of radiation than typical animals would be, and I'm sure have some sort of reduced lifespan or slightly greater likelihoods of cancer, it seems like after 3 decades that actual change is probably seems pretty minor.
The nuke. For the first time in history, humanity harnessed the power to annihilate itself in its own atomic Armageddon. In our timeline, the 1950s was an era of American exceptionalism and happy optimism. The suburban family, with their white picket fence, jukebox diners, and classic post-war nostalgia, are looked back on as a different time. It passed. The Cold War ended, and the Red Scare along with it. But what if that era, that mindset, never went away? What if technology improved, but the Cold War, fear of communism, and the culture of the 50s continued on into the 21st century and beyond? Welcome to the world of Fallout. The game series Fallout has a deep lore based on alternate...
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting to me is when you look at the study of history, you look at other cultures, they draw large lines along cultural norms. They will say things like, the Aztec elites reserved certain colors, certain types of jewelry for themselves, and it was illegal for commoners or tradesmen to wear them. And this would be a statement about fashion that would remain persistently true for hundreds of years. But think about our era, where you might say something like, men keep their hair short. Well, that's not really true. And you'd certainly, if you look back 300 or 400 years, that's not really true at all. Especially not in almost every culture, right? Men's fashion sort of wavers and waxes and wanes. Similarly, if you said things like women wore long dresses, well, not really. Women can wear long dresses and men generally don't wear tunics. But, if you went back 300 years ago, totally different set of rules. So it's fascinating that, again, is it because the archaeological record is not as robust about changes in fashion over time? Are these statements just sort of general statements that you make in pop science? Or is it something else? Is there something about modernity that creates this continuous evolving of culture? And it makes me wonder when I see things like Fallout where they say, the 1950s couldn't possibly, that aesthetic, that vibe couldn't possibly persist for 40 years. But look at the modern cinema era. There's very, very few high-grossing movies that are original. The largest movies are recycled franchises. In fact, they're recycled franchises from the 1950s and 60s. Spider-Man, The Avengers, Thor. These are characters who were created in the 50s and 60s, and their lore is just simply being updated and continued today. So are we as bankrupt culturally as the Fallout universe? In some ways, the answer may be yes. Look again at the latest Oscars. Who was on stage? Chris Rock and Will Smith? These guys are in their 50s. Where are the new artists, the new actors, the new it people? They're not there. They're just recycling old cultural tropes. Again, this is sort of like an unformed thesis, but if you say, Fallout's unrealistic because of their fixation on the 50s for an entire half century, I argue that's not really the case.
History, in a timeline that differentiates from our own. The world went down a much darker path, and in result, the nuclear holocaust came. In Fallout, the nuclear war was just the end of a chapter in mankind's history, and in the rubble, brought on another. Because even though society itself was destroyed and the land radiated beyond reason, new factions still arose, and humanity found new reasons to kill each other in a world populated by ghouls and mutants. That is why in the Fallout universe, the saying stays true. War never changes. This video is to give you a summary of the world of Fallout and to catch you up on the lore of this universe before the big kahuna itself comes out.
Oh man, poor Fallout 4. If you guys looked back in my history, you know about 6-8 months ago, maybe a year ago, I was live streaming Fallout 4 and I just had to stop because it was so buggy.
Fallout games take place in an alternate timeline that diverged from our own in the mid-20th century. Sometime after World War II in the 1950s and 60s, the United States drastically changed itself in an attempt to stop political strife and better organize its own government. The US divided the states among 13 different commonwealths. The Commonwealth would be one step higher than the state, but below the federal government and consist of multiple states. However, the Commonwealths began competing against one another and only weakened the country as a whole.
So this is probably sort of an analogy to the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were the tools or the organization prior to the Constitution. You may notice, if you've studied American history, you know that in the late 1770s, right? I think 1781 was when the U.S. finally defeated the British at Yorktown. But the Constitution was not signed until some time later, right? Several years. I think 5 years, something like that. And in that iteration, the colonies were governed by the Articles of Confederation. They also fought the War of Independence under the Articles of Confederation. And this was a much, much looser document. It had an extremely weak federal government. You can barely call it that. It looked more like the EU today, where they would meet and discuss issues facing all of them. And because every state had an incentive to kick out the British, they were able to coordinate on that specific goal. But as soon as that goal came to an end, they basically started working to sabotage each other. And so they realized that for the United States to function, they needed a stronger federal government. And that federal government took the form of, well, the constitutional government we see today, something that had the ability to actually order the states around in certain very specific and narrow fashions. There's actually an argument that when the Constitution was drafted, it still wanted a very weakened federal government, and that this weak federal government was deferred many, many things to the states. For a long time, for example, the Bill of Rights, as it applied to court proceedings or trials, only applied at the federal level. So only if you were in federal court were you subject to the federal Bill of Rights. For example, the right to have a lawyer present. Well, actually, that's not a good example. The right to a jury trial of your peers, that sort of thing. And states were responsible for implementing their own specific Bill of Rights and legal proceedings. And if you were tried in state court, that's what you would be under. So it was a very different time in terms of how how governance happened, and it was a very different perception. It was a governance structure that was designed primarily with small agriculture, a small agrarian economy with limited trade and limited industry. It was never meant for the industrial world. It was never even meant for the post-industrial era we live in today. So when a certain lawmakers or justices say, hey, what would the founding fathers have wanted? Truthfully, and the founding fathers said this, they expected that the Constitution would change dramatically in response to changing circumstances. That's why they wrote in so many areas in which they said, you guys can make changes to this, both to your interpretation and to the actual document itself. And that was entirely designed so that it could be brought forward into the era in which it existed. It was probably their biggest act of foresight was that the world would change around them and that they needed a governance structure that could change with it.
As in our timeline, the Red Scare was in full effect throughout the post-war era. In this alternate timeline, the Soviets grow weaker, China comes in to take its place. The US has a new enemy on the global scale, and at the turn of the 21st century, it was still US foreign policy to do everything to destroy the communists. As the decades went on, the global oil supply began to run thin, leading to higher oil prices and competition. The United States went deeper and deeper into hostilities with former allies and neighbors. The already divided country began to lash out once the resources ran thin. In 2051, the United States accused its southern neighbor Mexico of destabilizing the border. The US placed sanctions on the country, causing it to collapse into political instability. To protect oil interests, the US invaded Mexico to maintain a constant supply between the two nations. This brash foreign policy reflected the dying nature of oil in the middle of the 21st century. Texas once.
So, what does he talk about? Well, the real concept is what's referred to as peak oil. Peak oil is the idea that at some point that there will either not be oil or the oil that we can find is so hard to access and refine that it will not be profitable to do so unless oil prices are extremely high. And of course, if oil prices are extremely high, then production will have to be extremely low. And so this sort of convergence of diminishing supply and rising demand is called peak oil. It would result in an exponential increase in the price of oil. And there were fears that that would actually be an environmental catastrophe that would occur long before any sort of larger climate scale effects. That hasn't been the case. Technology's ability to allow us to identify and extract new sources of oil has way outstripped demand growth. However, it's not universally true. In the past maybe 6 months, oil companies, despite the rising price of gas, oil companies and oil producing nations under OPEC have actually never been more profitable. What's happened is the supply and demand curves, the OPEC has actually shifted them. They've said, we are going to permanently reduce the supply, meaning that the actual price of oil is going to rise. It's going to increase as we produce more oil, right? Because demand is going to remain constant. And for a long time, there was a sort of constant triangulation between supply and demand, and OPEC, for a variety of reasons, acquiesced to keeping oil very inexpensive, But they've realized that instead of peak oil, what you may instead have seen is peak demand. If you look around at the price of EVs or just walk outside your door in the United States, even in cities and places that are not especially wealthy or especially cosmopolitan, electric-only vehicles are growing, right? The idea of electric and fossil fuel-powered power plants are going the way of the dodo. In a typical neighborhood in America, you'll see sometimes up to a third of houses have solar panels, basically turning the houses themselves into their own power generation stations. And so this all means that in a lot of ways, oil may be diminishing as a fuel source, and instead it may be used in increasingly niche applications where solar power or electric vehicles simply aren't feasible. I'm thinking things like high performance aircraft, high performance certain types of ships like diesel powered submarines. All of these things are, too complex for battery power alone. Something to think about. But anyway, the oil companies have identified this, and it seems like they're going to keep oil permanently, or for the foreseeable future, at this elevated price per barrel.
Booming in the early 21st century, now is covered in empty wells. This was seen throughout the globe. As prices rose, the Middle East countries held onto their oil. To combat the high oil prices, the European Commonwealth, basically an evolved EU, sent troops into the Middle East. The resource wars had begun. The Middle East nations and Europe would fight a drawn-out, bloody conflict over the oil wells of the region until they ran dry just 8 years later. Nukes were used on Middle East cities, causing the Americans to fear the possibility of a nuclear war at some point. Project Safehouse was born. Its official objective was to provide shelters in a supposed nuclear exchange. The vaults were born. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Europeans were left with nothing after the fighting, and the Commonwealth fell into civil war by 2060. As oil wells shriveled up across the globe, Alaska's wells remained, soon becoming the last place on Earth for cheap oil, making it a target to the People's Republic of China.
So it sounds like this is actually realistic in one simple sense. The world of Fallout is experiencing peak oil, and our timeline, instead of peak oil, is instead experiencing a falling demand for oil. And again, it's not set in stone, right? If demand for oil rises again, then you're going to see this sort of elevated price point achieve crisis levels. And it could happen in the future. Again, this is something that's set 40 years from now. We could experience a peak oil if we are unable to drop our oil consumption fast enough and wells again begin to run out. Accessing the existing wells are too expensive. I mean, you have to think it's still worth it, even at $2 a gallon, to build an offshore oil rig, which is pretty insane. But they're literal money factories, so I guess that's our reality.
China in the east. The Americans saw that Alaska was in danger and set up a defense force to deter the Chinese. But the inevitable happened, and China sent an invasion force into Alaska in 2066, sparking the Sino-American War. This was the war that would define the Fallout series. Over the next 10 years of fighting, the United States and Chinese would dedicate their greatest minds to creating new and powerful weaponry to one-up the other. The US created robots for war and power armor to devastate the enemy forces. However, even with the advancement in the US military, the war would rage for a decade. Canada would be stuck with allowing US forces onto their land, which made tensions sour between the traditionally allied nations. As the war against China grew, the Americans wanted an easier route to combat the communists, and so in 2076, Canada was officially annexed by the United States. In a bid to direct Chinese forces away from Alaska, the US invaded mainland China, with soldiers wearing power armor. The objective was to cause enough damage at home the Chinese would need to take troops off of the Alaskan front. And it worked.
Okay, this is tactically something that does not make a ton of sense. And this is what I'm talking about. So logistically, which is easier to get? Okay, so where is it going to be easier to get to Alaska? From California or from Beijing? The answer is California. It's not hard. You have land. You don't need to use a port. You don't need to ship anything. You could ship everything by rail. You can ship it by car, right? You can even just drive yourself, or you could even walk there if you had to. In contrast, to get from Beijing to Alaska is a much, much, much harder prospect, especially if we're talking about the strategically important areas. We're going to actually see if we can do this here. Especially if we're talking about the strategically important areas. Okay, here's Alaska. Here's China, right? You can see that for China, they would have to cross several other countries. They would have to go from Beijing, right? And crucially, yes, they're not equidistant. And Beijing will have to come all this way. These are extremely remote, extremely unpopulated regions. In contrast, this is a heavily populated, BC, very populated, all the way to Anchorage, extremely populated. Beijing has an extremely long, extremely tenuous supply line, especially given that it has to cross this Bering Strait, if this is how they choose to do it. And it may prove faster to just go out of the Yellow Sea, through the Sea of Japan, and land troops in Alaska. The point is that there's almost no way that you are going to be able to steadily supply troops and material in any sort of numbers while using this incredibly tenuous chain. I can't begin to tell you how just unbelievably tough this land and sea supply chain would look like. In contrast, the US would have a massive advantage in manpower and supplies. So the idea that it's somehow beneficial for the US to have to invade mainland China, where it's suddenly creating for itself an even worse supply chain, is preposterous. Their best bet would have been to just double, triple, quadruple the amount of forces that the Chinese were facing in Alaska, and if possible, use their Alaskan forces to try to control the Bering Strait or another area in the Chinese supply line. But to open up another front where it's almost impossible to conduct a resupply, when instead you could have those troops much better equipped, much better manned, much better replenished by having them fight in Alaska, that's probably the least realistic part of all this.
The soldiers in China were trapped in Asia, but after nearly a decade of fighting, the Americans fought off the Chinese and reclaimed Alaska by 2077. With Alaska reclaimed, the war appeared over, at least on the American front. Countless lives were lost in the fighting, but it ended in an American victory, so to the people, the peace seemed to be won. But it was only a pause. On October 23, 2077, the Great War began and lasted only 2 hours. This nuclear exchange destroyed cities across the world. So many bombs were fired it completely transformed the Earth's surface. Water became irradiated. The environment itself was cancerous. Barely any organisms survived at all. Thus, the story of the pre-war nations ended in a blaze of nuclear fire. However, people did survive.
Again, this idea that you drop a nuclear weapon and things remain uninhabitable for years. Listen, Hiroshima itself is still a populated city. People still live there, right? Fukushima, the Fukushima reactor, other than a small number of areas, the people have returned largely to Fukushima and the reactor. So you're talking about the chances that you would have hundreds of years of persistent radiation is extremely unlikely, right? Again, this is probably one of the least realistic things where there's just a persistent, constant high level of radiation. The reality is that if you were to survive a nuclear attack on your city, you would want to do so first off by being indoors, away from windows, just like a tornado or any other disaster. You would also want to prevent radioactive ash and particulate from entering your space. So what you would want to do is, put like plastic over windows. Don't open your windows and doors. You just want it to be as difficult for the outside air to flow in as possible, right? Just like allergies. That's exactly how you should think about it, right? Indoors, your allergies are much worse. Indoors, they're generally better. Outdoors, they get much worse because of the fine pollen. So you have that. You wait 72 hours. After 72 hours, something like 60 to 80% of the ambient radiation will have burned itself off, right? If you can wait a week, the majority of the radiation levels will have gone down, other than in ground zero or in situations like Chernobyl, where it's not a nuclear explosion, it's actual radioactive nuclear material. That's a different story, but that's not what these weapons are for. So again, this idea of like persistent, constant radiation after a nuclear strike, not realistic.
Either out in the new wasteland or inside of massive fallout shelters scattered across the old United States. Officially, 122 vaults, as they were called, were constructed by Vault-Tec during Project Safehouse. The Vault's official goal was to provide safe harbor inside the shelters in case of nuclear war. They were capable of holding enough supplies and equipment that dwellers could survive inside the vault for long stretches of time. Each vault was given 2 Garden of Eden creation kits, or GECKs, so that the dwellers could recolonize once radiation levels went to healthy limits.
Which, again, would take weeks.
That was the supposed story. The United States and Vault-Tec in this alternate timeline had darker plans. Inside the government and major economic titans, there was a faction who believed themselves superior over the common American. and accepted that not many would survive the coming apocalypse. They made plans to preserve their own existence. These people formed what is now known as the Enclave. The American government funded the creation of the vaults, in which special American citizens could find safe harbor. However, this was just a ruse. The true purpose of vaults was to conduct physical, psychological, and social experiments on unsuspecting subjects. The vaults weren't meant to save the US population. It was simply to use vault dwellers as human guinea pigs. The Enclave's true plan was not just to repopulate the Earth, but to build themselves a spaceship to recolonize another planet.
Recolonize. He probably means colonize.
Using live human subjects would help the Enclave know how people react in long periods of isolated confinement. Each vault had its own specific experiment. For one example, the people of Vault 11 were told via intercom they had to sacrifice one of their own, or they would all be slaughtered. The angry people chose to sacrifice the Overseer, the leader of the vault, and so every year the position of Overseer was a position of being sacrificed, until one year the dwellers had enough and chose not to. A message played congratulating them for being good people and not killing anymore. Before the nuclear exchange, the Enclave, who consisted of the most powerful and influential in America, fled to secret bunkers throughout the globe. The owners of REUPLOAD, Vault-Tec, Poseidon Oil used their resources to protect themselves. The Enclave remained.
This is also pretty realistic. If you know, there's several billionaires who have bought large tracts of land and large properties in New Zealand. New Zealand is probably very sought after because it's isolated, extremely strong governance, and it is extremely amenable to agriculture due to the fact that it has basically no predators. So I don't think it even has any mammals. I think it's like all birds. Which is neat. There's some pretty cool looking birds there. But that's not the point. The point is that, yes, absolutely. Billionaires, high level officials, this is very common. There's also rumors that the Denver airport, which is, I think, the nearest major metropolitan airport to places like NORAD and some other bunkers that were meant to harbor the United States government in the event of a nuclear attack, also are sort of set up to be the same sort of isolated hub of command and control or governance in the event of a nuclear strike. So it's super, super common for elite people to try to get ahead of crises. And this is the other reality is that, yeah, people commonly people with resources can react to crises much sooner and much faster than other people.
On an oil rig, harnessing the technology from their wealthy connections and creating new weapons to eventually reclaim the land they believed they lost. In 2 centuries after the Great War, new factions rose and now fight over the nuclear wasteland. Most of the history that we know of takes place in the West. Around a century after the war, the region New California was split among isolated villages. Raiders and mutants terrorized innocent civilians. In some cases, vault dwellers left their shelter and set out to reclaim the wasteland, banding into small tribes and villages. Vault 15 survivors founded the community of Shady Sands. After a century, the growing settlement ambitiously renamed itself the New California Republic. It absorbed other small towns under its flag, and soon more towns followed suit to join its ranks. The NCR is not only a faction, it is the closest thing in the post-war era that resembles a nation. With over 700,000 citizens, the NCR has modeled itself off of values before the Great War, even organizing its government into 3 branches. The NCR boasts the largest military in the known world, but consists of mostly rifle infantrymen. While the NCR has provided order within their lands, even going so far to collect tax, by the events of Fallout New Vegas, the NCR has grown to become imperialist in nature, sometimes forcing villages under its banner and bullying its neighbors into submission.
Okay. So this is one of my personal pet peeves. We talked about this in some other videos, specifically Seth's look at Company of Heroes, the game. And in World War I, right, the victorious French and British One, because they had big fortifications and they learned to make small plotting advances using massive artillery. By the time World War II ran around, Germany realized, because it had lost the war, that it had to find a new way of winning wars. It couldn't fight the old war again. You couldn't run it back because that strategy resulted in a loss. In contrast, the British and French believed they had won. They didn't believe, they had won. That meant that they thought that was a validation of their entire strategy up until that point. And this is an incredibly dangerous line of thinking, because pursuing the same strategy as the environment you're pursuing it in changes is a recipe for disaster. You know, in mixed martial arts, one of the last steps people joke before an aging fighter finally hangs up the gloves is that they talk about getting back to the old them. They're going to sometimes they go back to their original gym. They train in the way they trained when they first debuted and were a young fighter, believing that old school training method is going to be the thing that brings them back to their old form, not realizing that their the training of 10 years ago, the fighter they were 10 years ago, is antiquated, and that the new generation has arrived, and that while physically they're aging, their training methods, their style of fighting, their strategy is all probably antiquated by a decade. And that's usually the last step, is once they realize that, no, it's not going back, it's that the world has passed you by, then that fighter usually retires.
NCR has fought major wars against other.
So to recreate the old government style that led to this crisis, not acknowledging the fact that there's some tremendous differences in the modern world of Fallout is erroneous and is setting yourself up for failure.
Factions, including their most recent rival, Caesar's Legion in the East. Caesar's Legion is pretty much the exact opposite of the democracy-valued NCR. Controlling the land east of the Colorado River, Caesar's Legion is a dictatorial slave state, which gained its power by absorbing the tribes of the Mojave. Caesar himself is actually a man named Edward Salo. He impressed the native tribes with his knowledge of basic military strategy. They declared Salo their leader, and in response, he declared himself the name Caesar. Caesar's new faction had a goal.
Okay, I want to point this out because it sort of bothers me. Knowledge of military strategy is time and place specific. Would a Roman general understand how to fight and win in Afghanistan? No, they wouldn't. They would know how to operate with the technology and legions under them. Similarly, if you took a World War I general and had them fight in World War II, right, without adapting and adopting new strategies, they would fail. So just having a knowing military strategy is not necessarily the same thing as it wouldn't necessarily carry over one for one.
To bring everyone and everything under their rule. They would go on a campaign of total war against the surrounding tribes, slaughtering and decimating the population, enslaving the survivors and indoctrinating them into the ideology of the Legion, using the men of each tribe as disposable slaves to wage war. However, even though Caesar ruled as a murderous dictator, his people worshipped him, fanatical in devotion to serve him. Caesar is the leader of his own personal religion, the Cult of Mars, which teaches that the Great War was punishment from the god of war himself. The Legion's growth brought them into contact with the NCR, where conflict raged between the two, with the Legion losing to the NCR in the First Battle of Hoover Dam. But while the Legion and NCR are the largest in the West, that does not mean they have the most fighting power. Of course, I'm talking about the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood is an elite organization of highly trained, devout, and honorable soldiers, with origins dating back to the old US military. The Brotherhood prides itself on its preservation and investment in technology. To them, their weapons and armor are the most important things, above all else. The Brotherhood was founded by American Army Captain Roger Maxson in the days before the Great War, after he and his men went AWOL upon learning of US-sponsored experiments on prisoners. The experiments had prisoners injected with the first evolutionary virus. The FEV was researched by the government to create soldiers capable of being stronger and more resistant. Instead, it made them into super mutants.
Wah, wah. The U.S. government does have a track record of doing that sort of things. One of their earliest experiments, not earliest, I think it was like in the 40s or 50s, was experimenting on new forms of chemical warfare, in which they ordered a group of junior soldiers to run an obstacle course. They said whoever runs the obstacle course the most times consecutively will get a 3-day pass or something. And so the soldiers just barreled through it, and unknowingly to them, the obstacle course was covered in like VX gas or some other horrible organic compound. They all became incredibly sick. I believe some of them died. And the US government was doing it to collect data on chemical warfare, using soldiers as guinea pigs. And while certainly that level of sort of cruelty isn't practiced today, soldiers are still used for experimentation. They're experimented on with, for example, new physical training protocols, new ways of doing exercises. Another example recently is that all soldiers, right, give a blood sample when they join for screening for blood type. They screen for certain diseases. And the U.S. then deposits that into a large repository of serums. And what they will do is they actually will allow researchers to access that proverbial blood bank. And what the researchers did, they looked at VA records and they looked at, say, hey, let's find soldiers who have contracted multiple sclerosis, MS, an autoimmune disease. Well, they looked at those soldiers and they looked at they actually looked at thousands and thousands of soldiers. And they found that, let's say something like 2/3 of the soldiers were exposed to, I think it's the virus that causes mononucleosis. They're like, hey, 2/3 of people got exposed to this virus. But of the third that didn't, not a one of them developed MS. So they said, hey, we think MS is the 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 like side effect of having this virus in your body. So the evidence is pretty airtight. It seems pretty definitive that this virus causes MS in some sort of way, form, or fashion. And we only know that because we were willing to do a little not experimenting on soldiers, right? It's a retrospective study, but using soldiers in research and data collection, right? There's a difference between, if they gave the soldiers the virus and saw if they developed MS later, that would be kind of messed up.
There was never a response from the US at Maxim's desertion, as the Great War came just days after. After the war, the group seized the futuristic technology from the facility, guns, and power armor. Glossing over a lot of history, the Brotherhood fought numerous campaigns against Raiders, the Super Mutants, and the NCR. In their search for more technology, the Brotherhood has spread throughout the old United States. However, due to the vast distance among them, ideologies are different between each group. The Western Brotherhood's numbers are small, practically never allowing outsiders into their ranks, but because of their collection of pre-war weaponry and highly trained soldiers, the Brotherhood is capable of putting up a valiant effort against their enemies. The Western Brotherhood believes Wastelanders cannot handle or be trusted with the powerful arsenal, and so they keep their technology top secret. The Western Brotherhood is the original Brotherhood, as the group has origins in California. That search for technology sparked members to send missions on airships across the continent, one of which crashed in the ruins of Chicago, forming the Midwest Brotherhood. The Brotherhood eventually reached the capital wasteland, the old ruins of Washington, D.C. Here, the super mutants were larger and more violent than in the West, and so the Capital Brotherhood adopted an ideology of protecting the Wastelanders over protecting technology, even recruiting natives into their ranks. This created a split among the Eastern Brotherhood. The soldiers devoted to finding technology deserted and formed the Brotherhood of Steel outcasts. The Western Brotherhood learned of the East ideology, a clear violation of the faction's code, and so the Capital Brotherhood was cast out.
Okay, so this is also very, very believable. Cults and religious organizations, insurgent movements, anyone who is characterized by an extreme form of belief, right? So not something within the norms for their society, but a fringe belief. They are, by definition, right, purists. They're people who cannot abide by who do not find a place even at the farthest extremes of society's like normal political spectrum. So it stands to follow then that they brook very, very little ideological deviation. So when you have something like this, where an already very small brotherhood of a cult, in this case, has a narrow ideological divide, which is, hey, we should use our technology to protect these people, whereas someone else like, hey, we should use this technology to kill mutants, when they're both, in practical terms, killing super mutants and raiders. That's the sort of thing that you would expect from a cult, right? Tiny, tiny differences can become big schisms because cult members are obsessed with purity and their leaders are obsessed with ideological purity. It's also how leaders need it to be this way to stay in control of their cult or religion. Because if you live in a world in which different ideas can coexist, then it means that the authoritarian figure, or the authoritative figure at the top giving the orders of the cult, to the cult or to the religion, that they are not infallible and that they can be questioned. And once you have followers questioning the leader, that's when the leader starts to lose their influence and power over the cult. So cult leaders do not brook this. They cannot abide by this sort of ideological questioning. So it makes perfect sense that the Brotherhood of Steel in California would completely excommunicate the Brotherhood of Steel in the East.
Members of the Brotherhood dot the US, such as in Texas and the Commonwealth, neither of which we know much about so far. The Brotherhood isn't the only pre-war faction that's still around. Remember the Enclave? The Enclave's descendants remained on the rig, harnessing the best technology their connections could buy. Being out of the blast range, they believed that they were the last remaining humans untouched by nuclear radiation, making them, in their mindset, true humans. The Brotherhood and Wastelanders are practically mutants in their eyes, and so their mindset turned genocidal, to kill the populace of the Wasteland and to start anew. The Enclave saw themselves as the continual government of the United States, and the rightful population to sustain it. Using their technology and flying vertibirds, they can challenge even the Brotherhood in power. However, they are practically gone in the West, and only remain considerable in the eastern United States. Yet even though there are considerable factions that control areas of the West and the East, much of the old United States is still left unclaimed. Even in areas under faction control, tribes and villages are the primary organization for Wastelanders. If I wanted to go into extreme detail with the entire history of each faction, that video would take hours.
Yeah, let me know, guys, if you want me to take a look at more Fallout lore. I certainly enjoy it.
And it's fun to discover the deeper lore by playing the games. This was a way to introduce new people to the world of Fallout and to hype up returning fans. Like on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.
All right, guys, that was pretty fun. Definitely check out our boys at the Alternate History Hub. But also, if you want to see some extra spicy reactions, check out the patrons. Check out Patreon. Thanks to our Lieutenant tier patrons. And until next time, guys, I'll see you in the next one.